Hello, everyone. Welcome to this question and answer on gluten-free eating. I'm Debbie, and I have got a fair amount of experience with gluten-free, personal and professional. So I thought, let's do a live stream and see if there's any questions out there that people are struggling with, and perhaps I can help you. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat, and we'll get started. And while you're at it, let me know where you're from. And if you don't have any questions, that's fine too. You just want to listen, that's great. But say hello and let us know where you're from. So I'm in Montreal, Canada at this time of the day and at all times of the day. And it's December 31st, so I hope everybody's having a good day. What is gluten? A lot of people really kind of wonder, what is gluten? They've heard the word, but what does it really mean? Well, gluten is a protein that is found in 3 grains: wheat, barley, and rye, and their derivatives, which means things that are made out of them. So that's only 3 foods out of how many raw ingredients do we have. But gluten is a very useful protein, and so it actually ends up being found in a lot of processed foods. And why would people eat gluten-free? And I'm going to answer that question in a minute, but I'm just going to try to post a comment because I tried to do that before starting and it didn't work. So let me try again. This time it's working. That's great. So the chat's working. Pop your questions in the chat. Why would people eat gluten-free? Well, there are several reasons. One of them is just some people just decide they don't want to eat gluten. It doesn't cause any particular issues with them. They just don't want to eat it. The other reasons are because possibly a person is allergic to gluten. They have a food allergy. That can happen. It can be very serious. So if you suspect any kind of food allergy, you should definitely see a doctor and get diagnosis and treatment plans. Another reason people might avoid gluten is because they have an intolerance, which is what I think I have, a digestive intolerance. And so eating gluten just causes my body a lot of digestive issues. And then the last reason is celiac disease. Celiac disease can be very serious, and that's where eating gluten causes the body to actually attack the lining of the small intestine. And the reason why that's so bad is because the small intestine is where a lot of the nutrition from your food is absorbed. And if the lining of your small intestine is being damaged, you don't absorb the nutrients from your food as well. So it can cause a lot of short and long-term health issues. And in the long run, it can even, result in people having very serious health issues. So figuring out if you do have celiac disease or not is a good thing to do. And I didn't do that, unfortunately. And I do have a video explaining my whole story of how I figured out that I can't eat gluten, but I'll just briefly do a synopsis here. It was during the pandemic, 2020, and access to doctors was a little harder. I was very sick, and I just suddenly had the thought, I wonder if it's gluten that's making me sick. So I decided to eliminate gluten for a few days, and I felt so much better, I couldn't start eating it again. And that's the mistake I made, because really all the advice out there says, if you have a digestive issue with gluten, or if you think you have an issue with gluten, go get tested for celiac disease before you stop eating gluten, because you need to have the reaction, the antibodies in your bloodstream to eating gluten in order for an accurate diagnosis. So please don't make the mistake I did. So now I'm in a situation where it's 2 years later. I've spoken to my doctor, and she says, well, if you want to get tested for celiac disease, that's fine, but you have to eat gluten for 2 months. And we're not talking 1 wheat cracker a week. We're talking every day eating gluten. And my reaction is, I can't do that. I'll be so sick for 2 months. I can't. So those are the 4 reasons why people might avoid gluten. And one of the things that happens to me all the time when I tell people I don't eat gluten, their reaction very often is, "What do you eat?" And I completely understand that reaction because gluten is everywhere. It is in so many foods because it's such a useful component for cooking and baking. But, you know, so that makes it hard. Plus, especially in certain cultures like we have in Europe and North America, where bread and pasta and pizza and are very, very common popular foods, staying away from gluten can be really hard. So, what I could suggest for you is if you cook for yourself already, then you're in a good place to learn how to eat gluten-free. It's much easier if you know how to cook and if you are already in the habit of cooking for yourself. If you don't cook for yourself, and if you eat a lot of processed foods, a lot of restaurant food, it's going to be harder to switch to eating gluten-free because you don't control what's in that food. And some restaurants are very good at letting you know if there's gluten in the menu, and you can trust them. They're reliable. They know what they're doing. But not all restaurants are like that. Some restaurants, you call them up and you ask them, do you have gluten in your food? And do you have any controls in your kitchen for any dishes that you might say are gluten-free? And they just kind of go, huh? So, it's a challenge. So my first suggestion for you would be to make gluten-free eating less hard, to make the transition less hard. Start learning to make some simple basic dishes. Cooking for yourself means you have control over the ingredients. You know what you're putting in your body. And I do have a whole video on how to manage restaurants and parties and eating out when you eat gluten-free. So I'm going to put a link to that in the video description. It has 13 tips to help you with that whole side of your life because it is and can be a challenge. So gluten-free eating can be hard. The transition can be hard. But it really depends on your starting point too. Are you comfortable reading ingredient labels or not? That makes a big difference. One of the things I'd say about eating gluten-free, and I've just forgotten my train of thought here, about the hardness of it. Yeah, I mean, and even for somebody like me, I worked in food production. I was actually the quality assurance manager of a gluten-free bakery. And then at a later point in my career, I was a compliance auditor, including gluten-free food production. So I know a lot about gluten-free. And when I started eating gluten-free, there would be foods that I would just automatically eat, like cabbage rolls. I had this favorite brand of cabbage rolls, and I loved them, and I would buy them. And I noticed, like, oh my gosh, I feel sick now when I eat this cabbage roll. And I looked at the ingredient list, and there was wheat in there. But it had never occurred to me to look at the ingredient list of that food because I was like, cabbage rolls? Why would there be wheat in cabbage rolls? But there was. So one of the things you need to do as you start to transition to gluten-free eating, or if you're struggling with it, is just to look at everything you buy, even stuff you've been eating for 20 years. Look at the ingredient list and see what it says. If there is wheat or gluten in there, barley or rye, it will tell you either in the ingredient list or in the allergen statement. And I do have a link that you can click on in the video description below where you can get my one-page synopsis of the foods that commonly have gluten and the foods that generally do not have gluten. So if you want to have my handy one-page list, then just go to the video description and click on that. Is it expensive to eat gluten-free? Well, yes, it's a little more expensive, especially if you're going to buy a lot of gluten-free cookies, gluten-free bread, gluten-free crackers, gluten-free pasta. All of this stuff is more expensive than their gluten counterparts. So my suggestion is just avoid it or learn to make your own. It will really be helpful if you can slowly adapt yourself to start moving away from all those foods that you loved, the breads, the pastries, the pasta, the pizza, and just start adding other foods in. I mean, quinoa doesn't have gluten, rice doesn't have gluten, buckwheat doesn't have gluten. So all of these make great substitutes in your meals for gluten. And buckwheat noodles, soba noodles, rice noodles, they work great instead of pasta. But it is an adaptation. And like anything in life, an adaptation is a change. Change requires time, it requires learning, it requires commitment, and it needs at least 3 to 4 weeks to really get cemented into your habit pattern. So be patient with yourself. Give yourself time to adapt. Start, if you eat a lot of pasta, then start experimenting with rice and buckwheat noodles instead, and maybe start just reducing the amount of pasta that you eat and putting other foods in instead. If you eat a lot of bread, you can start off with gluten-free bread, and then maybe you'll transition to other things like tortillas, corn tortillas, or tostadas, or other kinds of products like that, gluten-free crackers, at least in the beginning. If you spend money on some of these gluten-free replacement products, but then over time, try to find ways to actually reduce your consumption of them to save money, if that's what you want. And if saving money isn't an issue for you, then don't worry about it. And by the way, if you're watching this after the live stream, just pop your chat questions in the comments and I will answer them there. So, is gluten-free food good? Actually, most of the raw ingredient foods on this planet are gluten-free. Fruit, vegetables, legumes, bunch of grains, meat, fish, seafood, dairy products, they're all naturally gluten-free in their raw state. It's when they get processed into finished products that very often wheat is added in, or rye or barley, because gluten is a great binding agent. Gluten is a great thickener, and that's why it's used so much. That's why it's used in gravies and all kinds of products like my cabbage rolls. The other thing that's amazing about gluten, and it's hard to replicate in gluten-free baking, is gluten is strong and it's stretchy, which is why you get these amazing pastries when you work with gluten flours, especially wheat flour. But if that's not an option for you, there are other things you can eat. So the majority of the foods on the planet are gluten-free. And if you cook them without adding gluten, and you can do that, cornstarch is gluten-free, and cornstarch is a very good substitute for wheat as a thickener. Also, chia seeds and flax seeds are great thickeners. So there are other options out there for thickening your foods. Chia seeds especially also are good binding agents because they get sticky and glutinous. So depending on what you're making, they can be a very good binding agent. So there are other options out there. You don't have only wheat if you want to make foods without gluten. So gluten-free eating can be amazingly delicious. And I know I have a ton of recipes that I cook, and people that can eat gluten, I don't tell them it's gluten-free. They eat it and they're like, wow, this is amazing. Yeah, thank you. And it's gluten-free. And they just look at me like, oh my, I didn't know that gluten-free could be so good. And if you want to know more about my recipes, you can check out my channel. There's a bunch of gluten-free recipes on there. And from now on, well, for the last 5 months or so, every recipe I put on my channel is gluten-free. So is it tricky to eat gluten-free? It can be. And I'll give you an example. When I started on my gluten-free journey, I love tabbouleh. Tabbouleh's made with couscous. And even me, with all my training and experience, I didn't realize that couscous was made from gluten, from wheat, from semolina, which is made from wheat. So I was eating it, but then I started to feel sick, and I'm like, why am I feeling sick? So then I read the ingredient list and the allergen list, and I researched it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, couscous has wheat. It's wheat. So there are a whole bunch of names for different products that come especially from wheat, like farina, like semolina, like couscous, and that's just durum wheat, and that's just to name a few. So it's good to learn these names, but if you're not sure, it's good to learn how to read an ingredient list and an allergen statement. If there is gluten in the food, and if you live in North America, probably Mexico as well, probably most parts of South America, but I don't really know too much about South American food labeling. New Zealand, Australia, European Union, and UK. If you live in any of those places, if there is gluten in the food, there will be an allergen statement or some kind of indication to tell you it's either gluten or wheat or rye or barley. So just get comfortable reading those ingredient lists to make sure that you're not buying something that has wheat in it. But getting used to that can be quite tricky. And download my page, which has all the names listed of products that do come from wheat and barley and rye, and that can help you out as well. Now, eating out can be tricky, like I said, going to restaurants, eating in people's houses. So if you want more tips on that, you can check out my video on that. And if you want to know more just about gluten-free eating in general, and especially the nutrition of gluten-free eating, I do have another video on that as well, because gluten-free bakery products especially generally contain less protein and more carbohydrates, because there's no gluten. And very often the replacement flour blends that are used to make gluten-free bakery products are using a lot of starches, which are mostly carbohydrates, and not so many protein sources. So I'm going to be doing more videos on that, on gluten-free flour blends and which ones are the best ones that work depending on the application, and how to up the protein content of your gluten-free flour blend, so that you're not just getting, a ton of carbohydrates and sugars in your in whatever you're making. I hope everyone has a good day. So like I said, if you like this content, please give me a like, subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will answer them in the comments. I hope everybody's, having a fabulous day. It's foggy here and above freezing, which is very unusual for us for this time of the year. But, weather is as weather is. And if you do want me to do another Q&A on gluten-free eating, please let me know that as well. If you have friends that need to eat gluten-free, share this video with them, share my channel with them. There's tips on eating gluten-free and recipes. And I hope you guys, everyone who watches this today or later on, is going to have a wonderful 2023. I hope you stay healthy. Give me a subscribe if you like this content. Give me a like if you like this content. And I want to thank you so much for watching. I want to thank you for your support. Happy New Year. And I will say goodbye. Bye.